The morning fog stung stubbornly to the fields of northern France, hiding the remnants of a war that had already scarred the land. Private James Jimmy Marshall tightened the straps of his helmet and scanned the horizon through the steel-framed binoculars, heart-hammering. The roar of artillery echoed in the distance, a grim reminder that retreat was no longer an option. Jimmy's unit, part of the 101st Airborne, had been pinned down near a small village by German forces entrenched in fortified positions. The Americans were outnumbered and outgunned, but morale remained deceptively high, fueled by stubborn determination and the fear of surrender. Beside him, Corporal Henry Hank Roberts checked his rifle, the sweat from his brow mixing with the dirt smudges on his face. "Jimmy, you ever think about how quickly things can change?" Hank muttered. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the rumble of distant explosions. Jimmy didn't answer immediately. He had thought about it constantly. War was supposed to be straightforward. Fight, survive, come home. Yet here, under the gray sky, everything felt surreal. One moment they were advancing with hope. The next, they were being cut off by unseen enemies, the air thick with gunfire and uncertainty. Then it happened. A sudden burst of machine gun fire from a German bunker tore through the field ahead. Men fell around them. The screams mixed with the sharp cracks of bullets. Panic surged, but the soldiers' training kicked in. Jimmy dove into a shallow ditch, the cold mud seeping through his uniform, his pulse racing. Hank landed beside him, his face pale but composed. "Stay low. Follow my lead," Hank hissed. They crawled inch by inch, the ground trembling beneath them as shells exploded nearby. It was a nightmare come alive, a blur of smoke, blood, and chaos. Hours passed like this, a continuous battle between instinct and fear. Eventually, the Americans were overwhelmed. Surrounded and out of options, the surviving soldiers raised their hands, signaling surrender. Jimmy's stomach twisted with a mix of relief and dread. They were alive, yes, but now they were prisoners. The German soldiers moved quickly, binding wrists and searching bodies. Jimmy felt the cold barrel of a rifle pressed against his back, guiding him toward a waiting truck. The faces around him reflected his own emotions: disbelief, shame, fear. They were Americans, and now they were captives in enemy territory. As the truck rattled along the dirt road toward the POW camp, Jimmy looked at his fellow soldiers. Faces he had laughed with only days ago were now masks of tension and silent terror. He wondered who among them would survive the coming days, the coming weeks, the coming months. And deep down he knew that the war wasn't over. It had only taken on a different, darker shape. For Private James Marshall, the true battle had just begun. Not on the fields of France, but within the confines of barbed wire guard towers and the uncertain minds of men trapped far from home. The gates of Stalag 7A loomed ahead, a towering reminder that freedom had slipped through their fingers. Private James Marshall and his fellow prisoners were herded through the cold, gray entrance, the metallic clang of the gate echoing like a death knell. The German guards barked orders in clipped, harsh German, and even without understanding every word, the intent was clear: obey or suffer. Inside, the camp stretched endlessly. Rows of wooden barracks, barbed wire fences, and watchtowers manned by guards with rifles slung across their shoulders. Smoke from a distant cook fire curled into the sky, carrying the scent of boiled cabbage and stale bread. Jimmy felt a shiver run down his spine. The smell was strangely comforting and horrifying all at once. A grim reminder that life here was still life, but life under constant scrutiny. Corporal Hank Roberts scanned the camp, his trained eyes noting every guard, every fence, every potential weakness. "We've got to learn the rhythm of this place," he muttered to Jimmy. "Figure out when they're distracted, where we can move without getting noticed." The first night in the barracks was the hardest. The men were packed tightly, bodies pressed against each other for warmth, breathing the same recycled air. The whispers began almost immediately, stories of brutal punishments, harsh work details, and men who had disappeared without a trace. Jimmy lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, the wood cold against his cheek, and tried to make sense of it all. Food was meager: thin soups, a slice of bread, sometimes a small portion of margarine or cheese. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, but worse was the uncertainty. Would they see their families again? Would they survive the harsh German winter? Every day was a test of patience, endurance, and sanity. Despite the fear, camaraderie emerged. Jimmy found himself sharing stories with a fellow soldier, Private Luis Moreno, about home, baseball games, and silly pranks back at camp before deployment. These small connections became lifelines, fragile threads keeping the prisoners tethered to humanity. Even in the shadows of captivity, laughter sometimes slipped through, quiet, nervous, and fleeting, but enough to remind them they were still alive. Rules were strict and punishments swift. One prisoner, caught trying to hide a letter from home, was marched out to the yard and beaten. The others watched in silence, hearts hammering, knowing the lesson was intended for all of them. Fear was constant, but it began to shape a new kind of resilience, learning when to speak, when to move, when to keep one's thoughts private. In the quiet hours before dawn, Jimmy stared at the barbed wire beyond the barracks window. Snow dusted the ground, making the camp look almost peaceful from a distance. But he knew better. Peace here was fragile, temporary, and the real battle against fear, despair, and the unknown was just beginning. For Jimmy and the men of his unit, captivity had become a new kind of battlefield. It was not measured in miles gained or enemies defeated, but in days survived, in hope maintained, and in the small acts of courage that kept their humanity alive. Days blurred into weeks. The once distant fear of capture had solidified into a persistent reality that weighed on every move, every breath. Inside Stalag 7A, the rhythm of life became dictated by roll calls, work details, and the ever-watchful eyes of the German guards. Private James Marshall awoke each morning to the harsh clang of the bell, the sound echoing across the barracks like a summons to the unknown. The bunks were cold, and the thin blankets did little to keep the chill at bay. Sleep was often interrupted by shouts, guards inspecting barracks, or the coughs and groans of sick prisoners. Breakfast was meager, a slice of bread, sometimes a small portion of watery porridge. Jimmy learned quickly to stretch it, sharing sparingly with those who had none. Hunger was constant, gnawing at the stomach, but more subtle was the gnawing at the spirit. How do you stay human when the world seems intent on stripping you of every comfort, every certainty? Work details varied. Some men were sent to carry supplies, repair barracks, or in the surrounding fields. Others were tasked with cleaning, cooking, or performing menial tasks under strict supervision. Despite the monotony, Jimmy discovered that these tasks provided a strange kind of structure, a way to measure the passage of time and maintain some sense of purpose. It was during these small tasks that bonds were formed. Jimmy found allies in unlikely places. Private Luis Moreno, always quick with a joke, became his confidant. Sergeant Daniel Harris, a stern yet fair man, offered guidance and counsel. Together, they devised subtle ways to maintain morale, sharing stories from home, swapping scarce rations, even whispering jokes during work details. These acts, small as they seemed, were acts of rebellion against the despair that sought to consume them. The guards, a mix of strict disciplinarians and apathetic observers, were unpredictable. One day, a group of prisoners caught attempting to smuggle a letter was punished harshly, reinforcing the omnipresent risk of defiance. Yet, the men learned quickly how to navigate the boundaries, when to obey, when to hold back, when to exploit the small lapses in guard attention. Every observation became a lesson. Every moment of distraction, a chance to assert a flicker of freedom. Letters from home were a treasure, though often delayed or censored. Jimmy cherished each word from his mother, each scrawled line from his younger sister. They were lifelines, fragile threads connecting him to a world beyond the barbed wire. Reading them under the dim light of the barracks, he felt a surge of hope, a reminder that life existed outside the camp, and that survival was not just possible, it was necessary. Evenings were a mix of silence and quiet activity. Some men played cards, others wrote letters, while a few, like Jimmy, simply stared at the sky through the thin slats of the barracks window. The snow outside, though cold and unyielding, reflected the pale moonlight, casting long shadows across the yard. It was a hauntingly beautiful reminder that the world continued, indifferent to their suffering, waiting patiently for them to return. Through these routines and small victories, the prisoners began to transform. Fear remained, but it became tempered with resilience. Hopelessness lurked, yet hope, fragile as it was, persisted. Life behind the wire was harsh, unforgiving, but it was also a crucible, shaping men in ways battlefields never could. For James Marshall, the days of captivity were teaching lessons he could never have imagined: the value of companionship, the strength of endurance, and the quiet heroism of surviving each day in a place designed to break him. Weeks turned into months, and the monotony of camp life began to weigh heavily on the prisoners' minds. For Private James Marshall, each day brought a new struggle, not against guns or bullets, but against something far more insidious: the slow erosion of spirit that captivity inflicted. It was during the long, silent hours that the real battles took place. The mind, left idle yet constantly aware of danger, became both ally and enemy. Jimmy found himself replaying every decision on the battlefield, every misstep that had led to their capture. Guilt gnawed at him. Survivor's guilt, the quiet accusation that somehow he hadn't done enough. Conversations in the barracks revealed that he was not alone. Private Luis Moreno confessed one night, whispering through the darkness, "Some nights I wonder if we'll ever be the same again, if freedom will feel like home or just another kind of prison." Hank Roberts, ever the practical one, tried to shield his fellow soldiers from despair. "We survive," he said firmly, though the tight line of his jaw betrayed his own inner turmoil. "That's all we can do. Survive, keep our heads, and watch each other's backs." Yet even survival was a moral labyrinth. Food was scarce, and some men resorted to stealing or hoarding rations. When discovered, they faced punishment, but the ethical dilemma lingered. Take what you need to live, or preserve honor and risk starvation. For Jimmy, the question haunted him daily. Small acts of defiance became crucial for maintaining dignity. Whispering jokes, sketching portraits of fellow prisoners, or smuggling notes to the sick, all were tiny rebellions against a system designed to strip them of agency. Every smile stolen, every secret shared, was a victory against despair. Some nights, Jimmy and Luis would talk about what awaited them after the war, their dreams and fears laid bare in the dim light. "I'll never take my little sister's laughter for granted again," Luis said one evening, voice trembling, "or the smell of my mother's kitchen. Everything normal will feel like a miracle." But the mind under siege was unpredictable. Fear could erupt into rage. Jealousy, frustration, and hopelessness led to arguments, even fights between men who had once been brothers in arms. Jimmy witnessed Hank reprimanding another soldier for spreading panic after rumors of camp transfers reached the barracks. The tension was palpable. The thin line between sanity and breakdown stretched dangerously. Jimmy realized that captivity did more than test physical endurance. It tore at identity, morality, and faith in humanity. Yet in the same darkness, sparks of courage and resilience shone. It was in helping a wounded comrade, sharing a portion of bread, or whispering hope to a despairing friend that the true battle for survival was fought. By the time the snow began to melt, Jimmy understood something vital. The human spirit could endure horrors, hunger, and fear, but only if nourished by connection, hope, and the stubborn refusal to surrender entirely. Behind the wire, in the heart of enemy territory, the prisoners were learning that survival was not just about keeping the body alive. It was about preserving the mind, the conscience, and the soul. Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow and exposing the mud and frostbitten ground of Stalag 7A. For the prisoners, it brought no relief, only a reminder that the world continued beyond the barbed wire, indifferent to their suffering. Illness had begun to spread among the prisoners. Typhus and dysentery claimed strength quickly, leaving weak men pale and trembling. Jimmy watched as comrades who had joked with him just days ago now lay motionless, groaning under the weight of fever and exhaustion. Food was insufficient to fight disease, and medical supplies were scarce. Nurses and medics did what they could, but the situation was grim. Yet life inside the camp required more than mere survival. It required cunning. Small acts of resistance became essential. Jimmy and Luis began observing the guards' patterns, noting when patrols became lax, when gates were left unattended even for a moment. Together with Hank and a few trusted comrades, they whispered plans in the dark of the barracks, a network of secrets forged in trust and desperation. One night, under a moonless sky, a small group made their first attempt. They crawled silently along the edge of the camp, hearts pounding, every sound amplified by fear. Jimmy's fingers were numb from the cold, his breath shallow. For a fleeting moment, freedom seemed tangible, just beyond the wire, but luck was cruel. A guard, returning unexpectedly from the latrine, spotted them. Shouts pierced the night, dogs barked, and flashlights swept across the ground. The group scattered, some captured immediately, others narrowly escaping back into the shadows. Jimmy made it back to the barracks, chest heaving, drenched in sweat and mud. The taste of failure was bitter, but the spark of possibility remained. Tensions inside the camp escalated. Punishments for escape attempts were brutal. Extra labor, beatings, and isolation. Jimmy saw friends endure these penalties, yet their spirit, though bruised, remained unbroken. Every act of courage, successful or not, became a lesson in resilience, a silent rebellion against the system designed to break them. Amid the danger, relationships deepened. Comradeship was no longer optional, it was survival. Private Luis became Jimmy's anchor, always ready with encouragement or a quiet joke to diffuse panic. Hank's pragmatic mind guided them through the maze of rules and threats, while Sergeant Harris offered counsel rooted in experience and caution. Together, they formed a small circle of trust, a fragile shield against despair. The psychological strain was relentless. Sleep was haunted by nightmares of the battlefield and visions of what awaited outside, or what might never await at all. Yet each day survived, each challenge endured, became a testament to human endurance. Jimmy realized that the war was no longer about victory over an enemy. It was about maintaining humanity in the face of relentless adversity. By the end of the chapter, a lesson became clear. Freedom was not simply a matter of physical escape. It was cultivated in the mind. Every whispered plan, every small act of defiance, every shared laugh or morsel of food became a victory. Behind the wire, amid disease, fear, and harsh punishment, the prisoners learned to survive. Not just their captors, but the darkness within themselves. By late spring 1945, the air inside Stalag 7A was thick with rumors. The war was nearing its end. German guards moved with less precision, their faces betraying uncertainty and fatigue. Whispers of approaching Allied forces spread through the barracks like wildfire, igniting hope and anxiety in equal measure. Private James Marshall couldn't sleep that night. He stared through the narrow slats of the barracks window, the moonlight casting long shadows across the yard. For years, he had measured life in roll calls, work details, and ration lines. Now, freedom seemed almost tangible, but he feared it too. After so long in captivity, the world outside felt alien. Morning came with the distant roar of engines. Jimmy's heart leapt. Allied forces had reached the outskirts. The prisoners crowded near the fences, eyes wide with disbelief. The German guards, now disoriented and fearful, lowered their rifles. For the first time in years, the barbed wire felt less like a prison and more like a fragile boundary about to dissolve. The gates opened slowly at first, then all at once. Jimmy stepped into the open yard, his legs trembling under the weight of both exhaustion and exhilaration. Faces that had endured months of suffering lit up with tears, laughter, and cries of relief. Soldiers embraced, shook hands, and fell to the ground, overcome by the impossible reality. They were free. Freedom, however, came with a bittersweet taste. Some prisoners would never walk out alive. Names whispered in the barracks, the ones who had fallen to disease, punishment, or sheer misfortune, haunted the celebrations. Jimmy realized that while the body could be liberated, the mind carried scars that would endure long after the fences were gone. As they were transported back toward France, Jimmy gazed at the passing countryside. Fields he had once known as battlegrounds now looked serene, almost innocent. Yet he knew the memory of war and captivity would forever color his perception. The world outside the camp was larger, brighter, and terrifying in its complexity. Letters awaited him, messages from family he had almost given up hope of seeing. Embraces, laughter, and tears mingled in a chaotic reunion that left Jimmy dizzy. He felt joy, relief, and a lingering unease all at once. Returning home did not erase the memories of barbed wire, harsh winters, or the nights spent whispering plans under dim light. The journey home became a time of reflection. Jimmy and his comrades discussed the lessons of captivity, the value of companionship, the fragility of freedom, and the strength that lies in endurance. They spoke of the men who had been lost, the small victories that had kept hope alive, and the inner battles fought behind the wire. For Private James Marshall, liberation was not merely the opening of gates. It was a rebirth into a world he had imagined for years, a world that now demanded he reconcile the man he had been before capture with the man he had become. The war had taken much, but it had also forged a resilience, a courage, and an understanding of humanity that no battle could ever teach. And as he finally stepped onto the soil of his homeland, breathing in the scent of freedom, Jimmy knew one undeniable truth. Survival was not just about living. It was about preserving the soul through every trial, every shadow, and every long, relentless day behind the wire. The train rattled steadily toward home, the familiar landscapes of America passing by like fragments of a dream. For Private James Marshall, each mile brought relief, yet also a creeping unease. The world outside the window looked normal, fields, towns, children playing, but he felt foreign to it, a stranger returning to a place that had once been familiar. Homecomings were supposed to be joyous. Families waited, ready to embrace their sons, husbands, and brothers. Jimmy's mother stood on the platform, eyes glistening with tears, clutching a tattered scarf he had given her before deployment. He ran into her arms, feeling warmth and love, yet a hollowness lingered deep within. The memories of Stalag 7A haunted him. The freezing mornings, the meager rations, the cruel punishments, the nights whispering hope in the darkness, all clung to his mind like shadows refusing to release him. Sleep was often elusive. When it came, it brought nightmares that dragged him back to barbed wire, shouting guards and friends lost to illness or despair. He found solace in talking with fellow survivors, men who understood the invisible wounds of captivity. Luis Moreno, now a permanent friend, confided in him, "I keep thinking about the ones we couldn't save. I see their faces in every quiet moment." Jimmy nodded, knowing he carried the same burden. Survivor's guilt was a heavy chain, invisible but unyielding. Adjusting to civilian life was harder than Jimmy had imagined. Simple things, a warm bed, plentiful food, the laughter of neighbors, felt alien. He struggled with the noise of the city, the casual pace of life, the ease with which others spoke of battles he had endured firsthand. The war had changed him, shaped his perspective in ways words could scarcely capture. Yet, over time, he began to rebuild. He returned to work, enrolled in classes, and started writing letters. Not to distant family, but to himself, documenting the experiences he could never forget. Recording memories became a form of therapy, a way to honor the men who had suffered alongside him and to process the trauma that lingered beneath his calm exterior. He learned to find meaning in small victories, sharing his story with younger soldiers, helping a neighbor, or simply laughing with friends without feeling guilty. These moments became evidence that life could continue, even if the scars of the past never fully faded. Jimmy realized that survival did not end at the gates of Stalag 7A. It extended into every choice he made thereafter: how to live with loss, how to honor the fallen, and how to carry the lessons of endurance and resilience into a world that seemed at once familiar and strangely foreign. Though shadows of captivity remained, they no longer dictated every step. James Marshall had returned physically to freedom, but more importantly, he was beginning to reclaim his mind, his spirit, and his place in a world he had fought so hard to see again. The years after the war passed quietly, but not easily. For James Marshall, returning home did not mean returning to the life he had known. The streets of his hometown were the same, the houses unchanged, but he felt as if he were walking through a dream, real, yet distorted. The war had left invisible marks, scars on his mind that no embrace or celebration could erase. At first, his family tried to bring normalcy: meals together, visits with friends, and the familiar routines of daily life. But Jimmy found himself irritated by trivialities: the chatter of neighbors, the trivial complaints of civilians, the ease with which people move through life. He longed for the intensity, the clarity of purpose, even in the hell of the POW camp. Luis Moreno, who had settled nearby, became his constant anchor. The two men shared stories from their captivity, recounting moments of fear and small victories alike. "Do you ever feel," Luis asked one evening as they sat on a quiet porch, "that some part of us never left the camp? That we're still prisoners in a way?" Jimmy nodded, understanding perfectly. The mind could remain trapped long after the body was free. Returning to work presented its own challenges. The civilian world seemed slow, disconnected from the urgency they had known. Colleagues did not understand the layers of trauma, the sudden panic at loud noises, the recurring nightmares of guards, barbed wire, and fallen friends. Jimmy learned to navigate this world cautiously, concealing the darkness that lingered within. Family life was complicated. He loved his mother and sister dearly, but moments of closeness sometimes triggered memories of loss and helplessness. Nights were particularly hard. He would wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, visions of the camp vivid in his mind. The letters he had once treasured now served as anchors in the storm, reminders of why survival mattered, not just for himself, but for those who had waited for him. Yet amidst the struggle, small victories appeared. He began volunteering at the local Veterans Association, sharing his story with young soldiers and students. Each account told was a catharsis, a way to process pain while honoring those who had suffered and those who had not survived. Slowly, he learned that speaking, remembering, and teaching could transform trauma into purpose. Friendships deepened as well. Hank Roberts became a business partner, and together they built a small company, leaning on the discipline and resilience learned in captivity. Luis pursued education and eventually started a family, grounding himself in stability. Jimmy watched, learning that healing did not erase the past. It layered new experiences atop it, creating a mosaic of memory, pain, and hope. Years later, standing before a memorial dedicated to soldiers lost in Europe, Jimmy finally allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Faces from the camp flashed before him. The men who had laughed in the barracks, the ones who had endured silently, the ones who would never return home. Freedom had come at a price, and survival had been only the beginning of a longer journey, a journey to reclaim the mind, the heart, and a life worth living. In that moment, James Marshall understood a fundamental truth. Some battles never end, but they can teach resilience, compassion, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Behind the wire, he had learned to survive. Outside it, he had begun to live. A decade had passed since the gates of Stalag 7A swung open for James Marshall and his comrades. The war was a distant memory for most of the world, but for Jimmy, it lingered in every quiet moment, every shadow, and every decision he made. Life had grown complex and layered. He had married, started a family, and found steady work. Yet the scars of captivity remained subtle but persistent. Loud noises, sudden movements, or even the smell of certain foods could transport him back to the barracks, the mud, and the cold winter mornings. Nights were often the hardest. Dreams of the camp returned in vivid, relentless detail. Luis Moreno had built a small business and raised children who knew only fragments of his past. Yet even in the warmth of his home, Luis sometimes paused, staring into the distance, lost in memories of a friend who had not survived. A night of near escape, a comrade's whispered courage. Hank Roberts had pursued politics, advocating for veterans' rights. His speeches carried the weight of lived experience, earning respect and empathy from those who had never seen a battlefield. Yet Hank, too, carried quiet scars, manifested in sudden irritability and moments of emotional distance from those closest to him. The friends met regularly, forming an unspoken support system. Over dinner, they would share anecdotes, laugh at absurd memories, and silently mourn the friends who had not returned. These gatherings became sanctuaries, spaces where the past could be acknowledged without judgment, and where the shared understanding of trauma forged a bond stronger than mere friendship. Jimmy often reflected on the paradox of survival. He had endured hunger, fear, disease, and despair, and yet the greatest challenge had become the slow, persistent negotiation with memory. He had returned physically to freedom, but the mind required its own liberation, one that could take years, sometimes decades, to achieve. His children grew up hearing fragments of stories, of courage, resilience, and the strange bonds formed under extreme duress. Jimmy wanted them to understand, not the horror for horror's sake, but the lessons of endurance, loyalty, and the quiet heroism of ordinary men. These were the truths he carried forward, the legacy of survival that transcended the barbed wire of the past. Even after 15 years, the camp's shadow remained. Yet Jimmy had learned to coexist with it, using his experience to inform his empathy, his patience, and his appreciation for the fragility and beauty of life. The echoes of captivity were still present, but they had transformed, from chains that bound him to memories that guided him, shaping not just who he had been, but who he had become. And as he watched his children play in the sun, free from the fears that had once defined his own days, James Marshall allowed himself a rare, full smile. Freedom, he realized, was not simply the absence of walls or barbed wire. It was the ability to live fully, carrying memory as a teacher, not a jailer. The years had passed quietly, almost imperceptibly. James Marshall, now in his 70s, sat on a wooden bench overlooking the park near his home. The laughter of children playing drifted on the breeze, a sound so ordinary yet profoundly moving. He breathed deeply, feeling the weight of decades, of survival, of memory, of lessons learned the hard way. His body was older, slower, but his mind remained sharp, constantly revisiting fragments of the past. Faces of friends and comrades flashed before him, some long gone, some still alive, and all etched into memory with an intensity only time and trauma could forge. Stalag 7A was no longer a present reality, yet it remained a lens through which he viewed life. Jimmy often thought about the men who had fallen, those who had laughed beside him, whispered in the darkness, or faced the cruelty of guards with quiet dignity. Their absence was a reminder of fragility, of the random, unforgiving nature of fate. Yet it was also a reminder of resilience. Every day they had survived had been an act of courage, a testament to the human spirit. He reflected on the choices he had made, some small, some monumental. How he had comforted a dying comrade, risked punishment to share food, whispered hope when despair threatened to consume his friends. These moments, he realized, had defined him more than any battle on the open field. His children and grandchildren often asked about the war. Jimmy told them not of the horrors, but of the lessons, the strength in unity, the value of empathy, the importance of perseverance, and the quiet heroism in surviving adversity with honor. He wanted them to understand that true freedom was not simply the absence of confinement, but the courage to live fully, carry memory responsibly, and act with compassion. Sometimes, in the stillness of the evening, he revisited the camp in his mind, the frozen barracks, the harsh roll calls, the whispers of hope. Yet those memories no longer shackled him. They had transformed into guides, reminders of endurance and markers of the depth of human resilience. The fear, the hunger, the despair, they were shadows that illuminated the light of survival and the strength he had discovered within himself. James Marshall understood, finally, that the story of a prisoner of war was not just about captivity. It was about the lifelong journey that followed, reconciling the past with the present, nurturing life after trauma, and finding meaning in each breath, each smile, each ordinary day that was once taken for granted. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the park, Jimmy felt a profound sense of peace. He had endured, he had survived, and he had lived, not only to tell the story, but to honor the men who had shared it with him. Behind the wire, he had learned to survive. Outside it, he had learned to live. And in that quiet, fleeting moment, he knew that this life, memory, connection was the ultimate victory. The night was quiet, but for James Marshall, quiet was never comforting. Even decades after the gates of Stalag 7A had opened, the camp haunted him relentlessly. The creak of the floorboards, the whistle of wind through the trees, even the distant bark of a dog could transport him back to the freezing barracks, the bitter cold, and the endless roll calls that had marked his days of captivity. He woke with a start, heart hammering, sweat soaking his shirt. The shadows in his bedroom stretched and twisted like the barbed wire fences of the camp. He could see the faces of men who had suffered, of friends who had been too weak to survive, and of guards whose eyes had once struck fear into his very soul. Luis Moreno, his closest friend from those days, had once told him, "The body may leave the prison, Jimmy, but the mind never forgets." Jimmy now understood the truth of those words fully. Some nights, he lay awake, listening to his own breathing, and wondered whether the memories would ever loosen their grip. He often replayed moments in agonizing detail, the first night in the cold barracks, the taste of meager rations, the echo of shouted orders, the cries of men punished for the smallest infractions. Each memory was vivid, as if it had happened yesterday, yet distant, like a nightmare he could neither wake from nor escape. Sleep was a battlefield of its own. Dreams twisted reality. He was back in the barracks, yet outside it was spring and warm. He would reach for friends who weren't there, search for his own bed in a world that no longer existed, and feel the familiar panic of being caught in the shadows. Waking from these dreams often left him trembling, disoriented, and grateful for the light of morning. Yet the mind under siege also taught him resilience. He had learned coping strategies over the years: deep breathing, long walks in the park, and writing down every fragment of memory that threatened to overwhelm him. By confronting the past, he slowly reclaimed the power it once held over him. Therapy had helped too, though it was slow and painstaking. Sessions with trained psychologists allowed him to unravel the knots of trauma, to understand that fear, guilt, and grief were natural consequences of what he had endured. He began to forgive himself for surviving when so many others had not, and to honor their memory not with shame, but with courage. Even amidst these shadows, life offered small victories. Watching his grandchildren play freely, sharing stories of resilience, or laughing with old friends like Luis and Hank became moments of illumination. They reminded him that though the ghosts of the past were never fully gone, they could coexist with joy, meaning, and purpose. James Marshall understood a profound truth. Survival had been only the first step. The real journey, the longer, more intricate one, was living fully after captivity, navigating the labyrinth of memory, and finding ways to honor the past without being imprisoned by it. And so each night when sleep came, Jimmy faced the ghosts once more. But now he did so with a quiet determination to remember, to endure, and ultimately to live. Returning home had been both a relief and a shock. The streets of Jimmy's hometown were familiar, yet every corner reminded him of the years he had spent away, years marked by hunger, fear, and confinement. Life had moved on while he had been trapped, and now he faced the challenge of finding his place again, not as a boy or a young soldier, but as a man irrevocably changed. His family welcomed him with open arms. His mother, aged and softened by worry and time, clung to him as though she would never let go. His sister, now grown, tried to bridge the years with chatter about school, friends, and small-town events. Jimmy smiled, hugged them, and listened, but a part of him remained distant, carrying invisible chains forged in the barracks of Stalag 7A. Everyday routines became exercises in patience. The smell of fresh bread, once comforting, sometimes reminded him of meager rations. The laughter of neighborhood children, and so ordinary to everyone else, sometimes pierced him with memories of laughter lost in the camp. Even meals were complicated. He often left the table early, unsettled by abundance he had once only dreamed of. Luis Moreno, who had returned shortly before him, became a lifeline. Over long walks and quiet evenings, they shared thoughts they could not voice to anyone else. "They don't understand," Luis said one night, staring at the flickering street lamp, "what it's like to carry years of fear in your chest." Jimmy nodded, feeling the truth of it. Family loved him, but only someone who had walked the same frozen corridors could truly see the weight he carried. Slowly, he began to bridge the gaps with his loved ones. He shared stories not of horror, but of endurance. Small victories in the barracks, moments of human kindness, acts of quiet rebellion that had kept him alive. His children, curious and wide-eyed, absorbed these lessons, learning that life was precious, fragile, and sometimes won in the smallest gestures of courage. Yet conflicts emerged. Jimmy's wife sometimes grew frustrated by his sudden withdrawals or his inability to join fully in celebrations. "You're here," she said one evening, voice trembling, "but part of you is still there. You need to let us in." It was a difficult truth for Jimmy to accept. The past had shaped him, but he had to allow the present to shape him as well. Therapy sessions helped him navigate these challenges. Gradually, he learned to communicate, to express fears, and to explain the invisible scars of survival. Family dinners became less strained, evenings more filled with laughter than silence, and over time, the distance between past and present narrowed. By the end of the year, Jimmy realized he was no longer merely surviving. He was living. The bridges he rebuilt with his family were fragile but strong, fortified by patience, understanding, and the shared commitment to embrace the present without abandoning the lessons of the past. And for Jimmy Marshall, that realization, the ability to reconnect, to love, and to participate fully in life again was perhaps the most significant victory of all. It had been 10 years since the gates of Stalag 7A had closed behind James Marshall and his fellow prisoners, yet the bond formed in those harsh months remained unbroken. A reunion had been arranged at a quiet lakeside cabin, far from the bustle of the city, a place where the echoes of the past could be shared safely without intrusion or judgment. Jimmy arrived first, carrying a leather satchel with photographs, letters, and keepsakes from the camp. Each item was a relic of survival: a scratched pocket knife, a worn journal, a faded sketch of a barracks scene. He laid them carefully on the table, tracing each with a fingertip, reliving the moments they represented. Luis Moreno arrived shortly after, his face lined with the same mixture of relief and trepidation. Hank Roberts, now a public figure in his community, brought a quiet confidence, tempered by the weight of memories he seldom shared outside such gatherings. Sergeant Daniel Harris appeared last, older, quieter, yet commanding the same presence that had guided them through countless trials years before. For a long moment, none spoke. Words were unnecessary. The silence carried decades of shared experience. Then, slowly, conversations began. They reminisced about the absurdities of camp life, the small rebellions, whispered jokes, and daring attempts at mischief. Laughter, hesitant at first, grew louder, mingled with sighs and occasional tears. "I still remember the night we tried to crawl past the east fence," Luis said, eyes glistening. "I thought we'd never make it." Jimmy chuckled, recalling the mud and cold biting at his fingers, and then a guard showed up from nowhere. "I thought it was the end," Hank nodded. "But somehow we survived it all. Each day, each mistake, each tiny victory. It built us." They shared deeper memories, too. Friends who had fallen, moments of despair, the cruel punishments, and the silent courage that had kept them alive. The conversation was punctuated by tears and long pauses as the weight of years and trauma settled upon them. Yet amidst the grief, they found solace. Being together, recounting stories in a space of understanding, allowed healing to unfold in subtle ways. They realized that the camp had shaped them differently, but the essence of their survival was shared. Jimmy saw courage in Luis's eyes, resilience in Hank's demeanor, and quiet wisdom in Sergeant Harris. Each had carried the scars differently, yet each had endured. As the sun set over the lake, painting the water gold, Jimmy felt a profound sense of closure. He was not alone in his memories. They were shared, carried collectively, and transformed into something less burdensome. The reunion was more than nostalgia. It was affirmation. They had survived, and they had thrived, despite the shadows that lingered. When the evening drew to a close, Jimmy, Luis, Hank, and Harris sat together in companionable silence, listening to the gentle lapping of the water. Freedom had been earned years ago, but understanding and reconciliation with the past had only just begun. In that quiet moment, surrounded by those who had witnessed the same horrors and joys, Jimmy realized that the bonds forged in adversity were among the truest victories of all. The reunion by the lake had brought laughter and shared memories, but it also reopened old wounds. As the night deepened and the first stars appeared, James Marshall found his thoughts drifting to those who had never returned, friends who had been swallowed by disease, malnutrition, or the harsh punishments of the camp. Luis noticed the change immediately. "You're thinking about them," he said quietly, his hand brushing Jimmy's shoulder in silent solidarity. Jimmy nodded, the names of the fallen surfacing in his mind. Private Thompson, whose quiet humor had kept them sane during the coldest nights. Corporal Reeves, whose courage in the face of punishment had inspired everyone, and so many others erased from the present yet alive in memory. The lake reflected the stars, serene and indifferent, much like the world that had once ignored their suffering. Jimmy whispered the names aloud, a ritual he had repeated in solitude for years, but now shared with comrades who understood the weight of remembrance. Each name carried a story, a small victory, a life lived under impossible conditions. Hank Roberts broke the silence. "I think about them every day," he admitted, "not just those we lost, but the ones who survived alongside us. Sometimes the guilt, it's hard to bear. Why did we make it when they didn't?" Sergeant Harris, who had always spoken sparingly, added, "Survival isn't always fair, but honoring them, remembering, telling their stories, that's how we carry their legacy forward." The men shared tales of those lost, laughter mingling with grief. Jimmy recounted how Thompson had once sneaked extra bread to a sick comrade, a small act of defiance and kindness that still resonated in his memory. Luis spoke of Reeves' whispered encouragement during a brutal work detail and how it had kept him moving when every muscle screamed to give up. As the night wore on, Jimmy felt the familiar ache of survivor's guilt, but also a growing sense of purpose. Remembering the fallen was no longer just an act of mourning. It was a call to live fully, to honor their sacrifice through compassion, courage, and dedication in the years that followed. He realized that while freedom had been won decades ago, the responsibility of memory was ongoing. Each day, each choice, each act of kindness became a way to keep the fallen alive, not as ghosts haunting the present, but as guiding spirits shaping the future. By the end of the reunion, Jimmy understood that shadows of loss would never fully vanish. But in the quiet reflection by the lake, surrounded by surviving comrades who shared his grief and remembrance, he also understood that those shadows could illuminate a path, a way to live with integrity, empathy, and a commitment to carry forward the lessons learned behind the wire. The night ended not in despair, but in quiet determination. Together they had faced loss again, and together they had turned mourning into memory, grief into guidance, and the pain of survival into purpose. The street James Marshall's hometown had changed subtly over the years. New shops had opened, old neighbors had moved away, and the rhythm of life had quickened in ways that felt foreign to someone who had spent years in the rigid, punishing cadence of a POW camp. To Jimmy, the world seemed simultaneously familiar and alien, a paradox that left him feeling adrift. Returning to work was one of the first challenges. The office environment, with its casual chatter and routine deadlines, felt trivial after the life and death stakes of Stalag 7th A. Colleagues, unaware of the depth of his experiences, struggled to understand his quiet intensity and occasional emotional withdrawal. Meetings that once seemed mundane now frustrated him, their small conflicts and misunderstandings trivial compared to the constant vigilance required in captivity. Even simple social interactions carried weight. A casual remark about complaining over minor inconveniences could trigger a flashback to the punishing cold or the scarcity of food. Jimmy learned to mask his reactions, nodding politely while his mind revisited harsh winters, disease, and the faces of men who had not survived. Luis Moreno faced similar challenges. He had built a successful business, yet every decision seemed to echo the strategic thinking developed during captivity. The patience, observation, and caution honed in the camp gave him an edge professionally, but sometimes made him feel isolated in social situations, unable to fully relax or trust fully. Hank Roberts, now involved in politics, found the civilian world equally perplexing. Negotiating office politics, public speeches, and community expectations felt oddly disconnected from the life and death decisions of the past. Yet the resilience learned in the camp allowed him to persevere, and his experiences lent authenticity and gravitas to his advocacy for veterans. Jimmy often wandered the streets at night, reflecting on how quickly the world had moved on without him. Children played freely, unaware of the terror that had shaped him. Couples argued over trivialities, oblivious to the struggles of survival that had defined his youth. The disparity was jarring, at times isolating, yet it also reminded him of the value of life, small as it seemed, fragile as it was. Gradually, Jimmy discovered ways to reconcile his internal world with the external one. Volunteering at veterans associations, sharing his story in classrooms, and mentoring younger soldiers allowed him to bridge the gap between his experiences and the civilian environment. He realized that his past, though painful, could serve as guidance for others, a living testament to endurance, courage, and adaptability. Even amidst these efforts, the feeling of dissonance persisted. The camp had shaped him permanently, leaving a lens through which he interpreted the world. Yet, over time, Jimmy began to understand that adaptation did not require forgetting. Rather, it demanded integration, honoring the past, learning from it, and allowing it to coexist with the demands and joys of present life. By the end of each day, as he returned home to his family, Jimmy felt a fragile equilibrium. The world had moved on, but he had found a way to move with it, neither fully trapped by memory nor fully unmoored by freedom. In this delicate balance, he discovered the ongoing challenge and quiet triumph of life after war. James Marshall had always been a man of reflection, but as the years passed, he felt an urgent need to preserve the stories of survival, not only for himself, but for those who had never had a voice. He began keeping a journal, a meticulous record of every memory, every act of courage, every whisper of hope that had sustained him and his comrades during captivity. The process was both painful and cathartic. As he wrote, images of barracks, roll calls, and frostbitten nights returned vividly. He described the subtle kindnesses that had made survival possible: a shared loaf of bread, a whispered word of encouragement, a hand held in solidarity during moments of despair. Each entry served as a bridge between the horrors of the past and the lessons he wanted to pass on. Jimmy's grandchildren were fascinated by the stories. Sitting at his feet, they listened to tales of bravery, camaraderie, and resilience. He omitted the most gruesome details, careful to frame the narratives around courage and humanity rather than terror. It wasn't just about surviving, he told them. It was about how we lived while we survived. That's the lesson I want you to carry. Luis Moreno, now a frequent visitor to Jimmy's home, encouraged him to expand these journals into a book. "You have a responsibility," Luis said, "to show the world what it means to endure, to hope, and to hold on to humanity when everything else is stripped away." Jimmy agreed, though he worried that the weight of memories might overwhelm both him and his readers. As he wrote, Jimmy noticed subtle changes within himself. The act of storytelling allowed him to process lingering trauma, to confront guilt, and to honor friends who had been lost. Each chapter completed became a small victory over the shadows that had followed him since liberation. Writing transformed memory into legacy, grief into guidance, and isolation into connection. He also began sharing his stories with local schools and veterans organizations. Young students unfamiliar with the realities of captivity and war listened with rapt attention. Questions came, sometimes naive, sometimes profound, and Jimmy answered honestly, careful to balance truth with the humanity he had preserved. Each session reinforced his understanding. The past could teach, heal, and inspire if approached with care and integrity. By the end of each day spent writing or speaking, Jimmy felt lighter, as though each word released a small measure of the weight he had carried for decades. The camp, once a place of despair, had become a source of insight and empathy, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by pages filled with memories, Jimmy Marshall understood the profound gift of storytelling. It was more than recollection. It was a bridge between generations, a vessel for resilience, and a beacon for anyone facing adversity. Through his words, the echoes of the camp lived on, not as chains of suffering, but as lessons of endurance, courage, and hope. The children of James Marshall had grown up with fragments of a world they could scarcely imagine. To them, their grandfather's tales were both thrilling and solemn, a window into a life of courage, suffering, and endurance far removed from their own. Jimmy's eldest daughter, Clara, often sat by his side, notebook in hand, scribbling down every story he shared. She marveled at the resourcefulness of men trapped behind barbed wire, the quiet heroism of small acts, and the unbreakable bonds formed in adversity. "Grandpa," she asked one afternoon, "how did you keep hope when it felt impossible?" Jimmy smiled gently. "We held on to each other. That's all hope really is. The people beside you." Luis Moreno's children were similarly captivated. His son Marco often asked about the friendships forged in hardship. "Did fear ever make you hate each other?" he wondered. Luis shook his head. "No, fear brought us closer. It taught us who we really were." and what we could endure. Hank Roberts' daughters, growing up in a household of political debates and veteran affairs, saw the war as both history and living example. They understood that decisions, courage, and integrity were not abstract concepts. They were lived experiences, molded in the crucible of survival. Family gatherings became sessions of intergenerational storytelling. The grandchildren compared notes, asked questions, and sometimes challenged what they heard, prompting Jimmy and his friends to reflect on how much of the past was memory, how much interpretation, and how much lesson. These discussions shaped the younger generation's moral compass, teaching them resilience, empathy, and the importance of remembering history without being burdened by it. Jimmy noticed subtle changes in himself, too. Sharing his experiences with young minds softened the edges of memory. The camp's horrors no longer dominated his internal landscape. Instead, they were framed by legacy, responsibility, and hope. He found joy in witnessing how courage, friendship, and compassion could inspire behavior decades later, ensuring that the lessons of survival lived on. The children learned more than stories. They absorbed values. Clara volunteered at local shelters, inspired by tales of generosity and solidarity in the camp. Marco studied medicine, driven by the desire to heal and protect. Hank's daughters pursued advocacy and social justice, embodying the principles their fathers had learned the hard way. Through them, Jimmy saw a bridge between the past and the future. The war and captivity were not merely historical events. They were tools for shaping character, understanding humanity, and instilling a sense of responsibility for the lives around them. And as the sun set over the family home, casting golden light across laughter and conversation, James Marshall felt a profound peace. The next generation carried forward more than memory. They carried the spirit of endurance, the courage to act with integrity, and the compassion born from a history they never personally lived but deeply understood. Life, Jimmy Marshall had learned, never paused for reflection. Even decades after surviving Stalag 7A, challenges arrived with the same unpredictability that had once marked his days in captivity. Only now the trials were different. Not barbed wire or guards, but the subtle, persistent pressures of adulthood. Luis Moreno faced a sudden financial crisis in his business. A series of poor investments threatened to undo years of careful work. At first, panic gripped him, memories of helplessness from the camp creeping in. But then he breathed deeply and remembered the lessons of survival: patience, observation, and steady resolve. Leaning on Jimmy for support, he approached the problem methodically, seeking advice, cutting losses strategically, and relying on resilience he had honed during years of deprivation. Slowly, stability returned. Jimmy himself faced challenges at home. His aging father-in-law developed a chronic illness requiring constant care. Nights were long and exhausting, the kind of unrelenting strain that echoed the exhaustion of camp labor. But Jimmy drew upon his experience of enduring physical and emotional hardship. Each task, each small victory in caregiving, reminded him that endurance was not just about surviving extreme conditions. It was about commitment, empathy, and consistency. Hank Roberts encountered political obstacles, bureaucratic red tape that threatened initiatives for veterans' welfare. The frustration was intense. Every delay felt monumental. Yet his time in captivity had taught him strategic thinking and the value of persistence. He navigated the political maze with patience, drawing strength from his past triumphs over far greater challenges. Even Jimmy's children faced dilemmas. Clara struggled to balance her volunteer work with school, feeling the weight of responsibility in ways reminiscent of the burdens carried by those who had survived extreme adversity. Marco, while studying medicine, faced ethical dilemmas and emotional fatigue that tested his resilience. Watching them, Jimmy and Luis recognized echoes of their younger selves, struggling, yet capable of endurance. These trials, though mundane compared to war, illuminated a profound truth. The skills learned in captivity, discipline, observation, patience, and emotional endurance were transferable to life's many arenas. Challenges became opportunities to apply hard-won lessons from the past, and each small victory reinforced the value of resilience. Through shared support, Jimmy, Luis, and Hank navigated the storms together. Even ordinary struggles became meaningful when approached with solidarity, empathy, and the quiet courage that had once kept them alive in a world ruled by fear and scarcity. They celebrated each victory, small or large, with the awareness that life itself, though unpredictable, was to be met with determination and grace. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon each evening, casting long shadows across the neighborhood streets, Jimmy often reflected on the strange symmetry of life. Survival in captivity had not ended with freedom. It had prepared them for the trials of everyday existence, teaching lessons that continued to resonate long after the war. In this way, even ordinary struggles became proof of the extraordinary strength forged in the crucible of the past. And Jimmy Marshall understood that true endurance was not merely surviving the unimaginable, it was living with courage, compassion, and purpose, day after day, long after the battles had ended. The bus rumbled along the narrow European roads, and James Marshall felt a familiar mix of anticipation and unease. Decades had passed since the gates of Stalag 7A had closed behind him, yet the memory of the camp was as vivid as ever. Now, standing at the threshold of his past, he wondered if the ghosts of his youth would greet him, or if he would finally find closure. Arriving at the site, Jimmy was struck by the quiet serenity that now enveloped the area. Where once there had been harsh barracks, barbed wire, and the relentless sounds of captivity, there were now memorials, walking paths, and signs commemorating the lives of prisoners and those who had not survived. Time had softened the harsh edges of the landscape, but it could not erase the memories etched into his mind. Luis Moreno joined him, sharing the journey that had been years in the making. "It's strange," Luis said softly, "to see it peaceful now after all the chaos it held." Jimmy nodded. "Yes, it's almost comforting, yet surreal." Walking along the paths, they paused at markers with names of prisoners who had died. Jimmy traced the letters of men he had known, their courage, humor, and sacrifice immortalized in stone. He whispered their names aloud, feeling both grief and gratitude. These markers were more than memorials. They were bridges between past suffering and present understanding. They entered the reconstructed barracks, now part of a museum. The air smelled faintly of wood and polish, a far cry from the damp, freezing interiors they had once endured. Yet each plank, each bunk, each artifact brought memories flooding back. Jimmy could almost hear the shouts of guards, the whispered encouragements, the quiet solidarity of men enduring unimaginable hardship. Meeting historians and descendants of former prisoners offered new perspectives. Jimmy listened as stories were pieced together, discovering accounts of resilience, innovation, and small acts of kindness that he had never known. Some stories were tragic, some inspiring, but all added layers to the understanding of what had truly occurred. As the day drew to a close, Jimmy found a quiet bench overlooking the campgrounds. He closed his eyes, letting memories wash over him, the cold, the fear, the hunger, and the moments of unexpected camaraderie. Slowly, he felt a shift within himself. The camp, which had once imprisoned him in body and mind, was now a part of history he could observe, honor, and integrate into his life rather than be haunted by it. Luis sat beside him in silence. "Do you feel free?" he asked. Jimmy smiled faintly. "Not free from memory, no, but free from its control. We survived, and now we understand. We honor what was lost by living fully." The visit was more than a journey to a physical site. It was a pilgrimage of the mind and heart. Jimmy realized that reconciliation was not forgetting. It was acknowledging, honoring, and making peace with the parts of life that had once caused torment. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm light across the grounds, Jimmy Marshall felt a rare sense of closure. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him entirely. Standing there, he understood that true reconciliation came not from erasing memory, but from embracing it, learning from it, and allowing it to guide life with wisdom, empathy, and courage. For the first time in decades, the camp felt less like a prison and more like a testament to survival, endurance, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The morning sun filtered softly through the curtains of James Marshall's study. His hands, lined with age, rested on the worn pages of his journal. Outside, birds sang and children played in the yard, unaware of the decades of history that had shaped the man watching over them. Jimmy's eyes wandered over the photographs pinned to the wall, images of comrades, family, and moments captured in time. Luis Moreno, Hank Roberts, Sergeant Harris, men who had endured the unendurable and had emerged alive, carrying both scars and wisdom. Each photo was a reminder of the courage, loyalty, and humanity that had defined their survival. His grandchildren, now older, often visited. They asked about the war, the camp, and the experiences that had molded him. Jimmy shared stories carefully, focusing on lessons rather than terror, the strength of camaraderie, the importance of empathy, the value of hope even in the darkest times. Clara, Marco, and their cousins listened intently, absorbing not just the tales, but the moral guidance embedded within them. The weight of memory, once a burden, had transformed. Jimmy no longer felt trapped by the shadows of his past. Instead, they had become teachers. He reflected on the paradox of survival. It was not merely escaping captivity that mattered, but the ability to live fully, carry memory responsibly, and impart wisdom to those who followed. He remembered the friends who had not survived, the countless small acts of courage, and the moments of despair that had defined years of his youth. These memories were now part of his legacy, a tapestry of endurance and humanity he would pass down to his family. Walking through the garden, Jimmy paused to watch his grandchildren play. Their laughter, free and unburdened, filled him with a profound sense of peace. He realized that freedom was not merely the absence of barbed wire or guards, but the ability to nurture life, joy, and connection. It was the capacity to embrace each day, to act with integrity, and to honor the past through compassion and understanding. Even in his final years, Jimmy continued to write, to speak, and to teach. His life was a bridge between the horrors of war and the possibilities of peace, between memory and action, between suffering and hope. Through him, the lessons of survival endured, guiding those who had never known captivity, yet who could learn from its truths. As the sun set, casting golden light across the yard, James Marshall sat quietly, absorbing the moment. He understood now that the ultimate victory of survival was not merely living through the unimaginable, but finding meaning, joy, and purpose afterward. In the laughter of children, the bonds of family, and the enduring memories of comrades, Jimmy Marshall found his peace. The past remained a part of him, but it no longer defined him. It illuminated him. And in that illumination, the legacy of survival endured, a testament to the resilience, courage, and humanity of those who had once walked behind the wire. And so ends the story of James Marshall and the men who walked through the shadows of Stalag 7A. They survived hunger, fear, and despair, not merely to live, but to learn, to endure, and to pass on the lessons of courage and humanity. Dear listener, as you close this chapter, remember that survival is not always about escaping danger. It is about the strength to carry memory without being imprisoned by it, the courage to act with kindness even when the world seems cruel, and the wisdom to honor the past while embracing the present. The story of Jimmy, Luis, Hank, and all those who endured the unimaginable is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Their victories were small and great, quiet and loud, often unseen, but they remind us that hope can thrive even in the darkest places. May their journey inspire you to face your own challenges with patience, empathy, and courage. May you carry forward the lessons of endurance, the power of human connection, and the understanding that every life, no matter how tested, has the capacity to leave a lasting legacy. Thank you for listening. May the echoes of this story remain with you, not as shadows, but as guiding lights, illuminating the strength and beauty that can emerge from even the harshest trials.